The lifeblood of the Allied effort in World War II was the convoy system that delivered men and material to the various theaters of war. This story is about the Naval Armed Guard, the sailors who manned the guns and protected the merchant vessels that made up the Atlantic and Arctic convoys. This is the story of Gun Crew 256.
Gun Crew 256, when you start to look at it, is an unbelievable story.
The country needs them. They take whatever duties given to them. And believe me, nobody, I don't think, would pick the Arctic convoys as their first choice.
The convoys were a real problem to muster and to shepherd across the ocean.
When it came time to get things done, things got done.
That Battle of the Atlantic, that is the longest battle of the war.
If you look at the year that they were together, it was very harrowing.
3 mines floated within 30 feet of our ship.
It's critical that ships hold their position, keep the convoy together.
They dropped 25 more depth charges.
I'm sure there was a rather sinking feeling.
Their job was, as gunners, protection of the ship.
They were shooting off flares at night, enemy aircraft all around.
It was duty. It was their job.
I can't imagine losing all communications, having the vessel getting its butt kicked, and then you got to worry about a German sub. It's just got to be insane.
And however gallant they were, they would very quickly be overwhelmed.
U-402 puts a torpedo into her with tragic results. As she starts to go down, panic really does set in.
They were in 60-foot seas. You're going to run out of food if you're going to run out of water.
2/3 of the ships in that convoy were lost.
The 535 folks on board the Mallory, 202 survived.
I don't think my grandmother ever got over it, or my grandfather.
I think for my grandfather to survive that is a miracle.
It was probably the biggest single Allied convoy disaster of the war.
When America calls, it's guys like those members of Crew 256. They went out there, they put themselves on the line. I think that's a remarkable thing.
This is the story of 2 young men who joined the United States Navy in Philadelphia 1 week after Pearl Harbor. A story of their entry into the service the same day, training together, and becoming members of Gun Crew 256, part of the Naval Armed Guard. A story of young Americans new to the game of war and to the role of fighting for their country. Many members of Gun Crew 256 would not survive the war. Their small unit would soon be involved in the disastrous PQ-17 convoy to Russia and the sinking of the troop transport Henry Mallory. Of the 2 men who became friends after enlisting together in December of 1941, John James Dixon and Edward T. Ducky Doyle, only one of them would come home from the war. Our story, one of countless stories about the largest war the world had ever seen, begins in 1940 in Chester, Pennsylvania, and the nearby Philadelphia suburb of Narberth. Life in the United States in 1940 was anything but dull. As the 1930s ended, the nation was still working its way out of the Great Depression, while it seemed that the rest of the world was already at war. Germany had occupied Austria in 1938 and invaded Poland in September 1939, beginning the fighting that would engulf Europe and North Africa for the next 6 years. Japan had invaded China in 1937 and was aggressively seeking to extend its power throughout East Asia and the Pacific. Americans were concerned about the conflicts that were raging worldwide. A reluctant United States government was bracing for war, while isolationists, relying on the Neutrality Act, sought to keep President Franklin Roosevelt from joining or aiding any of the combatants. Meanwhile, average Americans like Ducky Doyle and John Dixon just tried to go about their business. Living in Narberth, just west of the city of Philadelphia, Dixon was working at the auto car plant in neighboring Ardmore. He enjoyed playing baseball and loved the town's annual Memorial Day parade.
Memorial Day was a very sacred day in our family. My father and my Uncle Frank were in the Army, and my Uncle John was in the Navy.
Times were good and getting better for John as the 1940s dawned. A few miles south of Narberth, in Brookhaven, Delaware County, Edward Thomas Doyle, Ducky to his friends and family, worked as a ship fitter. During high school, Ducky played football, basketball, and baseball. An exceptional athlete, he was still playing baseball during the summer of 1941.
He was very well known in the area. He was a very well liked individual.
Although Doyle and Dixon, 22 and 21 years old, were playing ball just a few miles from each other that summer, they had never met. They could not have known that following Pearl Harbor, they would not only become friends, but members of the Naval Armed Guard, assigned to the same gun crew on the same ship, and soon fighting for their lives. On December 14, 1941, John and Ducky enlisted in the U.S. Navy. The Naval Armed Guard. The U.S. Navy Armed Guard had its origin in World War I, when merchant vessels carried guns and Navy gunners. Although it was disbanded at the end of that war, it was reactivated in late 1941 as America edged closer to joining the worldwide conflict that was already underway. The Armed Guard was responsible for defending U.S. and Allied merchant ships from attack by enemy aircraft, submarines, and surface ships throughout World War II. The Navy men served as gunners, signalmen, and radio operators on cargo ships, tankers, troop ships, and other merchant vessels.
The Naval Armed Guard would have been trained in the use of standard shipboard weapons along the lines of light anti-aircraft weapons and also some of the somewhat heavier anti-aircraft and anti-surface weapons, maybe up to a 3, 4, or 5 inch.
During World War II, nearly 145,000 enlisted men and officers served in the Armed Guard. They sailed on more than 6,000 U.S. and Allied merchant ships, of which more than 700, more than 10%, were sunk. Armed Guard casualties numbered at least 1,810 killed or missing in action, a casualty rate that rivals that of any of the armed services during World War II. This was dangerous, difficult work. The typical Armed Guard complement for a merchant ship was 24 gunners with 1 officer, an ensign, lieutenant junior grade, or lieutenant, plus up to 3 communication personnel, for a total of 28 men.
They used a variety of weapon types. They would have anti-aircraft guns. Most of the stuff that was used on merchant ships was surplus to the requirements of the big ship Navy. A lot of it was, in fact, stuff that had been mothballed after the First World War and was broken out again for the Second World War.
In the early days of the war, however, many ships went out with much lighter armament and much smaller Armed Guard crews, most of whom went from recruits to gunners within a few months of entering the service. Ducky and John were no exception. Between January and April, they completed basic training at the Naval Training Station, Newport, Rhode Island, graduated from the Armed Guard School at Little Creek, Virginia, and had been transferred to Brooklyn, New York, for assignment to Gun Crew 256 aboard the newly commissioned Liberty ship Samuel Chase in Baltimore. The Samuel Chase, named for a Maryland signer of the Declaration of Independence, was built at the Bethlehem Fairfield shipyards near Baltimore. According to notes taken by Dixon, the Samuel Chase departed Baltimore April 22nd, stopping at Norfolk to load ammunition before sailing to New York and on to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where the ship joined convoy SC-83. On May 7, 1942, she departed with 61 other ships bound for the Firth of Clyde, Scotland, with the ultimate destination, Russia. As the convoy formed, the Samuel Chase took up Station 83, the 3rd ship in Column 8 of an 11-column convoy.
The weather, the icebergs, the storms, enemy activity, everything that he encountered, he put in his daily log.
The practice of accompanying valuable merchant cargoes with armed naval escorts had been followed for centuries, but the advent of submarine warfare during World War I led to the modern convoy as a defensive tactic. The British reinstituted the defensive tactic to protect their merchantmen at the start of World War II. Convoys generally consisted of 40 or more ships sailing in columns 1,000 yards apart, with some 600 yards separating ships within the columns.
Inside the convoy would be the things that you wanted to protect. The raw materials would be on the outside. So in the interior ships would be troop transports, might be tanks, might be tankers, might be ammunition ships.
A large convoy could occupy as much as 20 square miles of ocean. Their escorts, destroyers, corvettes, or Coast Guard cutters, patrolled on the port and starboard sides, searching the surrounding seas for U-boats. These North Atlantic convoys, though harrowing to those who sailed in them, were the lifeblood of the Allied effort to rid the world of the Nazi fascist menace.
This convoy is carrying critical war material for the Soviets, probably enough to equip almost a 50,000-man force. It includes tanks, Brin carriers, trucks, ammunition, guns of different calibers, artillery, and then also raw materials as well.
German U-boats terrorized Allied convoys from the beginning of the war. Early convoys were inexperienced and inconsistent sailing as a team.
Many of these merchant ships were small, old, and slow. Because they were small, because they were in various states of repair, the convoys were a real problem to muster and to shepherd across the ocean.
Commodores commanded the merchant ships, while escorts were commanded by a naval officer. Ships were manned by merchant seamen and naval gun crews. Guns were minimal, and air coverage was limited in range. Cut to the chase. The Samuel Chase arrived on 23 May 1942 at the Firth of Clyde after a voyage that included rough seas, loss of contact with the convoy, U-boat attacks, and a near ramming of the Winston-Salem on 20 May. As one of the largest areas of shelter deep in the British Isles, the Firth of Clyde was a natural mustering site for the large Atlantic convoys. Samuel Chase later sailed to Loch Ewe, and 5 days after arriving in Scotland, she joined convoy UR-26 bound for Iceland. Convoy UR-26 was made up of only 22 ships, 7 British, 12 American, 2 Norwegian, and 1 Dutch. The Samuel Chase took up Station 52, and the passage to Iceland was uneventful, with good, clear weather, and only 1 reported submarine contact. The ships arrived in Reykjavik on 2 June. 12 of the UR-26 ships, including the Samuel Chase, would soon join the disastrous Arctic convoy, PQ-17. The precarious Eastern Front. At this point in the war, Russia was on its heels, fighting the Germans' Great Summer Offensive. The Soviets were in a very precarious position, with German forces pushing hard to obtain the petroleum supplies in the Caucasus region. Hitler and his generals believed that with a major offensive in the summer of 1942, they could drain the Soviet Union of manpower, crippling its ability to continue the war.
The pressure from the Russians on the British, and by that time, of course, on ourselves for assistance, was very intense, and obviously it was very much in the interest of the Western Allies that Russia stay in the war.
In an effort to assist its ally, the United States extended the Lend-Lease program to include Russia and began supplying war materials by the 3 delivery routes: the long Persian Corridor route, the Pacific route that skirted areas of U.S.-Japanese hostilities, and the shortest, most direct, but most dangerous route, the Arctic convoy from Iceland along the edge of the Arctic ice. PQ-17. Gun Crew 256 spent 25 days in Reykjavik Harbor, confined to the ship with little to do. But on 27 June, the Samuel Chase formed up with convoy PQ-17 bound for Murmansk, Russia. What happened in the next 2 weeks is one of the lesser-known but most harrowing episodes of World War II. PQ-17 was the 17th in the first series of Russia-bound convoys that began in September 1941. The convoys ran twice monthly from Iceland to Archangel when the sea was open during summer months, or to Murmansk when the pack ice increased. It was the largest and most valuable in the history of the Arctic convoys, with cargo worth over $700 million. The ship's hold and decks were stuffed with nearly 300 aircraft, 600 tanks, more than 4,000 trucks and trailers, tons of ammunition and high explosives, and a general cargo that exceeded 150,000 tons, enough war material to boost the Russian army in its fight with the Third Reich. The convoy included 35 cargo ships with an armed escort of 21 additional vessels. Once the convoy cleared the harbor and was well out to sea, the ships took up their appointed positions in the convoy. The Chase took up Station 91, the first ship on the far starboard line of the convoy. Good fortune didn't seem to be on the side of PQ-17. Early on, 2 ships had to turn back. One suffered engine trouble just out of port, and another sustained ice damage and returned to Reykjavik. The summer route, which took the convoy farther north than the winter convoys, was along the western and northern coast of Iceland. The ship sailed just days after the summer solstice, when the protective cover of darkness was entirely absent in far northern latitudes.
This is July. In the Arctic areas, you've got 23 and a half hours of daylight. So really, what cover did you have? You had no night cover. So the only cover they really had was the fog that may roll in occasionally.
Discovery by the Germans. The valuable convoy had the full attention of the British Admiralty and unprecedented support. This support included the heavy covering force built around the battleship HMS Duke of York, 2 cruisers, and 14 destroyers reinforced by the American battleship USS Washington and the carrier HMS Victorious. Its orders were to trail PQ-17 at a distance of 200 miles and provide distant cover. The 1st Cruiser Squadron, a mix of Royal Navy, U.S. Navy force under British command and consisting of 4 cruisers and 4 destroyers, was assigned to provide somewhat closer cover. Rounding out PQ-17's protection was the close escort, 6 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 2 submarines, 3 minesweepers, 4 armed trawlers, and 2 converted anti-aircraft merchantmen. If PQ-17 had the Admiralty's full attention, it also had the full attention of the Kriegsmarine. Unknown to everyone in PQ-17, the convoy had been spotted by a German patrol aircraft operating from Norwegian fields. It was then sighted by U-456 1 hour later at 15:30. Upon picking up the convoy, U-456 began to shadow the convoy, transmitting detailed information about its makeup and course to Kriegsmarine headquarters. During the next few days, PQ-17 was closely monitored by U-boats, with visual contact between the Germans and the convoy intermittent, as the icy polar winds flowing over the warmer waters created welcome fog banks. As visibility fell to less than 100 yards in fog, the floating ice grew heavier. Ships began to experience ice damage. Although the fog was welcomed, when it lifted, long-range German scout planes appeared. Staying well out of anti-aircraft range, they remained only long enough to plot PQ-17's course and speed. Attacked. On 2 July, torpedo bombers attacked, but effective anti-aircraft fire kept the planes from damaging the convoy. But on 4 July, the American Liberty ship Christopher Newport, built next to the Samuel Chase in Baltimore, became the first German victim when she was damaged by aerial attack and sunk by submarine U-457. Despite this loss, the men of the convoy felt they had resisted well and were confident that they could complete the rest of the voyage. 2 weeks later, John Dixon described the Independence Day attack in his notebook. About 4:30 a.m. on the morning of the 4th, the enemy aircraft pennant was flown. We heard the engines of the planes and were all at our guns. The planes came in through low-hanging clouds and fog, and when about 50 yards away, they dipped down over a corvette and came across our beam. We opened with all guns and scored a number of hits before he swung back into the clouds. He might never have gotten back to Norway, and I sometimes think he did not. He dropped a torpedo on his way, Heinkel 115, and the torpedo went just astern of us and struck the Christopher Newport full on the starboard beam. It was a perfect shot, and she began to turn to port. The boats on that side were smashed, and the boat deck by the explosion. The gunners on the turret on that side were blown out and maybe killed. It really woke everyone on board up. On the afternoon of 4 July, a flight of 25 planes attacked in two groups, trying to divide the lethal defensive fire from the convoy. John Dixon wrote, "The big attack was carried out by about 50 planes, both torpedo and bombers. The action was coming thick and fast. We were scared before it came, but were too busy to be scared after it started. They got 3 ships, and we shot down 22 planes. Soon after the attack," Dixon wrote, "we were ordered to scatter and proceed by ourselves. The destroyers left us and went out ahead of the cruisers in battle formation. We went our way, and the rest took off in one direction or another." In London, First Sea Lord Sir Dudley Pound was monitoring the air and submarine attacks on PQ-17, but he had a bigger worry. Sporadic reports seemed to confirm that the German Bismarck-class battleship Tirpitz appeared to be moving out to sea, presumably in pursuit of the convoy. Admiral Pound, believing the Tirpitz and other German surface vessels were moving to pursue the convoy, issued an order to disperse PQ-17 and withdraw the first cruiser squadron rather than lose them to the heavy German surface units.
Pound decided that the risk of an encounter by the covering force, British cruisers, with German heavy units was too great. It would be a one-sided encounter, with the odds very heavily weighted on the German side.
Escort commanders received the Admiralty's orders in the form of 3 rapid messages on the evening of 4 July. The first message came at 21:11. "Most immediate and secret. Cruiser force withdraw to westward at high speed." A second message came 12 minutes later. "Immediate. Owing to threat of surface ships, convoy is to disperse and proceed to Russian ports." A final message ordered, "Most immediate. Convoy is to scatter."
So the last order, convoy to scatter, is what really sets the tragedy of PQ-17 in motion. There is a scatter plan for every convoy. It is the last resort of the convoy under serious threat.
With this final transmission, Commander Broom of the close escort could only assume that German surface forces were just over the horizon, and quite correctly, he pulled his 6 destroyers off the convoy to go support the first cruiser squadron. Despite the fact that an immediate surface threat was not over the horizon, given the tone of the Admiralty transmissions, Broom was certain he was leading his destroyers on a suicide mission against superior German forces, buying time for the merchantmen to flee the scene. Mayday, Mayday. By early morning on 5 July, remember that darkness never fell, the airwaves were filled with distress signals from stricken ships. By day's end, some 14 more ships would go down as they sailed either alone or in small groups. The German attacks continued for 3 more days without let-up. Roving aircraft flying from Norway caught up with many vessels, while prowling U-boats dealt death blows to the ships of PQ-17. Lieutenant John E. Sexton, commanding officer of Gun Crew 256, reported that the firepower of the convoy, including the one British anti-aircraft ship, was so ineffective that some German planes actually flew down the columns between ships. Escape. Notes from the Gun Crew 256 confirm that the chase had been covered by a fog bank and lost the German plane that had been following it. Reports were coming in from ships all around. They were being attacked by dive bombers, torpedo planes, and submarines. Chase headed for the nearest land after the communications with the anti-aircraft ship and 2 corvettes had signaled that the Tirpitz was out and gave her course. On 8 July, the remaining ships were greeted with fog. The nemesis to seafarers now became the best friend to all. The fog provided protection from sightings by the enemy, but the change in weather increased the potential for ramming another ship or the ice itself. Vessels sounded their sirens and horns and slowed to avoid collisions. The ice grew thicker, and ships dodged their way through the ice and fog. Staying close to the ice edge meant that only the starboard side of the ship was exposed to enemy submarines, but it brought its own dangers, floating ice blocks or icebergs that had to be detected and maneuvered around. For almost 2 days, the chase was dogged by planes and submarines. When a submarine that was tailing them submerged, a sure sign of an impending torpedo attack, the crew was ordered to abandon ship. All hands took to the lifeboats for 2 hours or more, but when no attack materialized, they reboarded the chase and got underway again.
Finally decide that the Germans must have missed them somehow and decide to come back aboard.
As gunner John Dixon details, "We crossed her course, but our luck held, and we didn't see her, and arrived at Novaya Zemlya about 4 the following afternoon to see about 4 other ships."
The Samuel Chase is one of the lucky vessels in PQ-17 and is able to generally avoid German threats as she tries to make her way to Murmansk.
Aboard the Samuel Chase and the other ships, the gun crews grabbed their first sleep for several days as they took shelter in the hidden harbor behind Matochkin Strait.
Not uncommon in some of the more intense convoy battles to read about accounts of them on duty for 24, 28, 30 hours in a row.
On 10 July, as the remnants of the convoy were making their way from Novaya Zemlya southward to the White Sea and Russia, the Samuel Chase was taking a beating from attacking aircraft. 6 near misses from enemy bombers caused heavy damage, snapping all steam lines, cutting off all auxiliaries, and blowing the compass out of the binnacle. Doyle and Dixon's ship was dead in the water. Safe harbor. The Chase was taken in tow by the minesweeper Halcyon off Cape Canaan. The Halcyon, through outstanding seamanship, was able to tow the Samuel Chase at a steady 5 knots. Several hours later, the crew of the Chase managed to restart her engines, and she finished the journey under her own power. Gun Crew 256 had fought their weapons efficiently and courageously in what naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison called the grimmest convoy battle of the entire war. Morison praised the Navy Armed Guard of 3 particular ships, Washington, Daniel Morgan, and Samuel Chase. Their clothing was inadequate and their ammunition insufficient, he wrote, but their fighting spirit never failed.
Like a lot of the vessels in the convoy, even though they may score some hits on some of the German aircraft, because of the lightness of the weapons on most of the merchantmen, there aren't a lot of German aircraft brought down.
Of the 6 brand-new Liberty ships, only the Samuel Chase and the Benjamin Harrison would safely make port. Ducky Doyle, John Dixon, and Gun Crew 256 had survived. By July 20, just 11 of the 35 merchantmen that left Iceland had finally limped into port. 14 of the sunken ships were American. More than 2/3 of the convoy had gone to the bottom, along with 210 combat planes, 430 tanks, 3,350 vehicles, and nearly 100,000 tons of other cargo. More than 153 seamen were lost, while some 1,500 others took to lifeboats, were injured, or became prisoners of war. The total financial loss is estimated to have exceeded $500 million. Repercussions. There would be significant repercussions as a result of the disaster. American Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of U.S. Naval Operations, was so enraged that he was very reluctant to have American and British ships continue operating together. The suspicious Soviets refused to believe that 24 ships from one convoy had been sunk. Shaken by the enormous losses of PQ-17, Prime Minister Churchill and President Roosevelt, over strong Soviet protest, postponed the sailing of PQ-18 until autumn.
The disaster of PQ-17, while it doesn't have any career repercussions for anybody at the Admiralty, it certainly makes the Admiralty very, very nervous about further Arctic runs, and they don't send another convoy until September, when they're past the 24 hours of daylight time period.
Much has been written of the decision to scatter the merchant ships of the convoy. Books have been devoted to the intelligence, or lack of intelligence, regarding the German fleet too. Questions were raised about the First Lord of the Admiralty, Dudley Pound, who made the decision to scatter, their reasons, and their concern for the safety of their warships. After it was all over, the thoughts that possessed every man aboard a PQ-17 ship are probably best summarized by Lieutenant Sexton, commanding officer of Gun Crew 256. Some events remain with us forever. I don't think I will ever forget the moment we were told to scatter. When we saw the signal from the Commodore and checked the signal book for its meaning, the captain and other officers on the bridge could not believe it. How could they desert us? It was a feeling of utter hopelessness. Scatter, but where? What course? Return to the west or press on eastward? We had been at GQ, General Quarters, for almost 24 hours, and it took some doing to collect ourselves.
I think one of the most astounding things about observing the behavior of merchant seamen in the Second World War is that, unconstrained by the bonds of discipline and organizational structure that control the lives of soldiers and sailors or airmen, that they nonetheless kept functioning.
But no matter where responsibility lies, this is a story about brave men who obeyed the order to scatter and did the best they could under terrible circumstances, and who were never properly recognized for their heroism and sacrifice. With the exception of several months in 1943, when the Battle of the Atlantic was at its peak, the convoys to the Soviet Union ran from 1941 until the war's end. Campaign ribbons were awarded for service in almost every other theater of the war, but none were given for service in the Arctic. Before the fighting ended, however, Allied seamen and gun crews had taken 1,526 individual ships in 77 different convoys on the Murmansk-Archangel run. Nearly 100 ships were lost to enemy action and the unyielding weather, more than a quarter of them in the PQ-17 convoy debacle. Allied losses in the Arctic eventually exceeded those in the North Atlantic sea lanes, and before the war ended, the Arctic route had accounted for nearly 37% of all Allied surface ships sunk in all theaters of the war. Both the gun and merchant crews of the Samuel Chase endured tremendous hardships. There has long been talk of issues between the merchant seamen and members of the Naval Armed Guard. The merchant seamen worked within a loose command structure and made good money. Members of the Armed Guard got a paltry $66 a month, defending the ship and crew and working under strict naval discipline.
I think it's vitally important that we remember that when America calls, it's not just members of the regular armed forces who respond, but it's guys like those members of Crew 256 who join the Navy because the country needs them. They take whatever duties given to them, and I think that's a remarkable thing.
Our two boys were far from home in the frozen north of Russia. After finally making port in Archangel, the Samuel Chase and her crew, along with the other surviving ships, were treated to daily air raids by the Germans. The men were restricted to their ships, with limited shore time, little in the way of food, and what seems a basic lack of trust on the part of the Russians. With the suspension of the Arctic run, Gun Crew 256 and the remaining survivors were in limbo. They were stranded in Russia until the next convoy, PQ-18, made it to Archangel and prepared to return as QP-14. Finally, on September 13th, more than 2 months after the PQ-17 scattered, the Samuel Chase weighed anchor on a cold, windy, and rainy day. Finally, they were headed west for home. The chase arrived in Loch Ewe on 26 September, 3 months after the start of their voyage to Archangel, accompanied by 2 British and 4 other American ships, the sole survivors of the 35 ships of PQ-17. On 1 October, Doyle, Dixon, and Gun Crew 256 began their journey back to the United States with convoy ON-135. Among the ships in that convoy was another PQ-17 survivor, the Benjamin Harrison, and a curious old passenger ship, the SS Henry Mallory. The men arrived at the Brooklyn Armed Guard Center on 20 October, 6 months after boarding the Samuel Chase in Baltimore. The Henry Mallory. In July 1942, the 26-year-old liner was requisitioned by the U.S. Army and converted to a troop transport, becoming USAT, U.S. Army Transport Henry R. Mallory. She was armed with 1 4-inch 50, 2 new 3-inch 50s, and 8 20-millimeter guns. 21 members of Gun Crew 256 reported for duty on November 13. Following the PQ-17, some of the gun crew transferred to other units, but Dixon and Doyle found that they were shipmates for a second time among the personnel put aboard the Mallory. In mid-November, the aging coastwise steamer gathered her military passengers, 19 Army officers, 5 Navy officers, and 17 enlisted personnel came aboard in New York. The ship then went to Providence, Rhode Island to receive 10 Navy officers and 310 Navy Construction Battalion enlisted personnel. Passage to Reykjavik. Returning to New York, the Mallory anchored near Staten Island, and on the morning of 17 November, she joined convoy SC-110 with 38 ships bound for Reykjavik, Iceland. Aboard were 9 officers and a 68-man merchant crew, 21-member armed guard crew led by Lieutenant J.G. J.L. Rohr, Jr., 2 Navy communications personnel, and 361 passengers. The convoy had 5 escorts, but because it could travel no faster than the top speed of its slowest ship, it could make just 7.5 knots. Another voyage was underway. On 19 November, at sea, Lieutenant Rohr reported satisfactory test firing of the new 350 guns and the new 20-millimeter guns. On 25 November, he reported very rough seas, resulting in the Mallory and other ships being separated from the convoy, with the Mallory not rejoining the larger section of some 17 ships until 2 days later. The following day, 33 ships managed to find each other, 5 fewer than had left New York. These were dangerous waters, constantly patrolled by German U-boats. On 28 November, Lieutenant Rohr reported a flag hoist announcing that submarines are known to be operating in these waters. On the 29th, depth charges were fired from escort vessels, and the Mallory executed an emergency change of course. Destroyers were moving at top speed down the columns of the convoy. Probably to the relief of all, the Mallory, along with 4 other ships and 3 escorts, departed the main convoy on an established turn, approximately 330 miles from the Irish coast. She tied up to North Key, Reykjavik, at 1600 on 4 December 1942. Her 361 passengers debarked to be moved by other transport to their theaters of operation. Reykjavik to Boston. After a week in Reykjavik, the Mallory was underway again, with 8 ships and 3 escort vessels, sailing at 7.5 knots to join convoy ON-152, which was westbound from the British Isles to North America. The small group joined the main convoy on 15 December, only to be beset by another Atlantic winter storm on the 16th. Gale force winds forced the Mallory to change course, heading into the wind to avoid damage. For 2 days, separated from the convoy, the old ship fought 50 to 60-foot waves and 100-knot winds. Battered and bruised, she rejoined a group of 16 ships and 3 escorts on the 19th. But 3 days later, she was once again separated as another gale arrived. Each time she reestablished contact with the convoy, there were fewer ships. By 23 December, just 5 merchant ships remained together without any escorts. They arrived at St. John's on Christmas Day, 1942, tying up alongside other ships midstream. In a letter written 57 years after these events, Victor Clark, a member of the Armed Guard on the Mallory, recalled his voyages on the Henry Mallory. On the return trip from Iceland, we encountered the worst and most ferocious storm I was ever in. 60-foot waves. The sea was white. The merchant crew ran life ropes from amidship to the galley. This went on for several days, and we lost all contact with the other ships. But we made St. John's, Newfoundland on Christmas Eve, tying up next to the Dorchester, a sister ship in the Mallory lines. We had turkey and ice cream on Christmas Day, 1942. The Mallory sheltered at St. John's until 2 January 1943, when she departed for Boston with 2 other merchant ships and 2 American destroyers, the Dallas and Bernardo, which had been detailed as escorts. The Mallory arrived safely in Boston at 1540 on 9 January 1943. Convoy SC-118. The Mallory departed New York City on 24 January 1943 with 36 other merchant ships. They were to rendezvous with 12 ships out of Halifax, 7 ships leaving St. John's, and 11 escort vessels to form SC-118, a total of 65 ships.
It consists of primarily ships that are to continue on to England with war supplies, but there's also a contingent that's set to break off to head north to Iceland. Included in that contingent is the SS Mallory, which is a troop ship, which will be delivering Marine, Army, and naval personnel to Iceland.
Standing on the bridge of HMS Vanessa on the evening of 6 February and looking over the 60-plus ships of Convoy SC-118, Acting Commander F.B. Proudfoot of the Royal Navy had every reason to be content. Stretching over a front of some 6 to 7 miles, the convoy and its screening ships of British Escort Group B-2 seemed to be under control. Although they had not previously worked together as a team, the entire group was performing well, one of the best yet in the Battle of the Atlantic. Unknown to Commander Proudfoot and the ships under his command, in late January, the cryptographic section of the German Navy High Command had intercepted and decoded an Allied routing message concerning SC-118. In addition, a sailor who survived the sinking of a tanker from the eastbound convoy HX-224 informed a U-boat commander that another slow convoy was following on the same route, 2 days behind HX-224.
We hear that World War II era slogan, loose lips sink ships, and tragically this is very, very true in this case.
These 2 pieces of information would cost hundreds of seamen and soldiers their lives. In January and February 1943, the North Atlantic was experiencing the most severe weather conditions in half a century. Storm conditions reigned for 116 of the 140 days of winter, with effects on both U-boats and convoys. Hurricane-force winds whipped up monumental seas, hindering visibility and forcing U-boats to submerge. The weather also took its toll on the convoy by disrupting its alignment, producing stragglers and damaging ships, some of which were lost without a trace. In addition, Allied convoys were endeavoring to vary their routes. Admiral Donitz countered by ordering his U-boats to extend their patrol line over a greater area.
He's able to bring just a little bit under 24 U-boats into position to intercept the convoy, and what ensues is considered one of the classic convoy battles of World War II.
At the time, the Germans had more than 175 operational submarines in the Atlantic, with at least 100 boats at sea in 2 groups patrolling off Newfoundland. The final Battle of the North Atlantic. Allied trackers detected signs of a buildup of U-boats in the 180-mile-wide Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland, an area known as the Bottleneck. Bad weather aided the convoy as it slipped through the western portion of the Black Hole, or the Air Gap, so named because it was the area south of Greenland, where protective air cover was either minimal or non-existent. Hurricane-force winds, limited visibility, and blunted German efforts to attack the convoy and the surface ships struggling to stay together under difficult conditions. The U-boats had been unable to find the convoy, but as the merchant ships regrouped, a seaman on the SS Anik accidentally set off a snowflake rocket. Surely the rocket would have surprised the officers and crew of the convoy ships, including the Henry Mallory, which was assigned to Station 33, the third ship in the third column on the port side of the huge convoy. But 20 miles away, the surfaced U-boats also observed the flare, and on the dark night of 4 February, they had found their target. The Mallory carried 34 armed guard members, including Doyle, Dixon, and another enlistment day pal, Robert Donahue of South Philadelphia. The gun crew followed the usual naval routine of 4-hour watches, manning stations in all conditions as the ship pitched through heavy seas. For 3 days, Proudfoot's escorts fended off U-boats. To assist in the defense of the convoy, Iceland-based VLR Liberators and additional escort vessels joined the fray. Group B-2 conducted itself well, but the unrelenting aggressiveness of 20 hungry U-boats began to break down the escort's coordination, and the Mallory, which was capable of 14 knots, reportedly had been straggling behind.
Even with her superior speed, she's not zigzagging to try to avoid the U-boat and their torpedoes, but she's simply straggling behind the convoy, not at high speed.
On 7 February, tragedy struck SC-118. In the pre-dawn hours, U-boat ace Siegfried von Forstner's U-402 torpedoed the British freighter Afrika, Norwegian tanker Dagahild, Greek freighter Calliope, American tanker Robert E. Hopkins, the convoy rescue ship Toward, and the American troop ship Henry Mallory. Historians and other writers noted that the Mallory, with nearly 500 men aboard, had been assigned a dangerous station in the convoy, being in Station 33, making it a target for U-boats from the port side and astern. Why was the Mallory, one of the most important ships in the convoy, not in the usual position for a troop ship, further into the interior of SC-118? Some reports have the ship ahead of the Mallory, repeatedly surging forward and then unexpectedly dropping back, while the following ship repeatedly pressed the Mallory from astern, at times coming alongside. Though these reports have the Mallory falling astern of the convoy, Boatswain Mate 3rd Class Peter Siganik, in charge of the Mallory's aft gun crew, reported in an after-action report that she was holding Station 33, but the vessel in Station 34 overtook her some 25 minutes before the attack, putting the Mallory out of position. On the morning of 7 February, the crew and armed guard were at battle station, with all guns manned and 16 lookouts posted. They had been at general quarters since the torpedoing of the tanker Hopkins around 02:30. Almost all aboard were turned in, with the exception of the armed guard crew and the merchant crew on watch. Attacked. At 0500, the lookouts were relieved and some guns were secured. The weather was overcast, with snow squalls, rising winds, and the seas were rough. It was hours before dawn in midwinter at this far northern latitude. Lookouts and gun crews were at general quarters. Lookouts at each gun, one at the forward 350 caliber guns, 2 on the bridge wings, and 2 astern. The new lookouts were on watch only 15 minutes and were still adjusting to the darkness, while less than a mile away, U-402 was aligning for an attack. There was no warning, no U-boat or torpedo sighting. At 0538 GCT, U-402's torpedo hit in the vicinity of number 3 hold on the Mallory's starboard side, tearing into the sickbay, the Marines compartment, and damaging number 4 hold. In addition to 383 passengers, a crew of 77, and an armed guard of 34. No commands came from the bridge after the Mallory was torpedoed. Phones and other means of communication were out. Men were jarred from their beds by the explosion. Many rushed on deck, while others were trapped in their compartments. There was confusion and concern, but in many cases, cooler heads prevailed. No flares went up, no radio distress message was sent, and no orders were given to abandon ship.
Initially, there's fairly good discipline amongst all the troops on board and amongst the merchant marine crew.
As the ship settled, boats and rafts were put over the side. Although the seas were rough, most boats and rafts should have gotten away, but only 5 of the 9 undamaged boats were launched from the ship. The absence of central command seemed to give rise to individual initiative, or in some cases, lack of discipline. The Mallory listed to starboard and started sinking by the stern. Boatswain Mate Siganek said, about 25 minutes after the attack and unsuccessful attempts to launch life rafts, I gave the order to my crew on the stern gun to abandon ship because the ship was listing to starboard. Many took to the 15 to 20 person donut rafts. In some, the men did not know about cutting the lashings to lower the floor, and as a result, many capsized.
There had not been extensive abandoned ship drills during the voyage up to that point. A lot of the crew was not very familiar with the ship itself in terms of what its life rafts and lifeboats were, what was available and how to deploy them.
One raft was frozen to its supports, so Navy personnel used balsa rafts instead. Balsa life rafts were designed to hold 5 to 10 men on a platform suspended on the inside and 15 to 25 hanging on lines placed on the outsides for swimmers. One member of the Armed Guard reported that many years later he still remembers.
They said abandon ship, so we cut the raft loose and it landed upside down. The first man to jump was a married man with 2 daughters, and he fell between the ship and the raft. His mistake revealed that we must wait for the raft to reach its highest point before jumping. 3 made it before me. I had a hold of a 17-year-old by the shoulders, told him to go ahead and jump. No, he said, I'm going to find the lieutenant. Neither of them made it.
Among other gun crew members, Doyle made it into a donut, but Dixon and Donahue were nowhere to be found. The Mallory sank within 30 minutes, with more than half of its passengers and crew lost. Those who made it to the few lifeboats or the donut rafts may have increased their chances of survival, but survival was the exception rather than the rule. Many boats and rafts were swamped in the frigid North Atlantic, and hypothermia killed those in the water in a matter of minutes.
I think the feeling must have been quite grim, because even if you got off the ship, even if you got onto life raft, you got onto a lifeboat, the survival chances in the North Atlantic in February are very, very low.
For more than 8 hours, the survivors bobbed in the cold February seas until the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Bib came in sight. The men breathed a sigh of relief, but worried that the Bib might not stop to pick them up because of the U-boat threat. The Germans had already torpedoed the rescue ship Toward, which trailed the convoy. The Bib radioed for permission to pick up survivors, but was told to rejoin the convoy. Despite the danger and the risk of court-martial, Captain Roy L. Rainey chose to ignore, directing his crew to pick up survivors. Their heroic efforts saved the lives of some 202 American sailors, soldiers, and merchant mariners. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Ingham and the French corvette Lobelia saved another 35. The Mallory sustained almost 60% casualties. Added to the 605 American lives lost in the sinking of her sister ship Dorchester a few days earlier in convoy SG-19, almost 900 were lost at sea in 1 week. The defensive efforts of convoys turned offensive after the passage of SC-118. By mid-1943, improved coordination among ships, better radar systems, and more escorts, including expanded air coverage, blunted the U-boat attack. After mid-1943, attacking an escorted convoy became a virtual suicide mission for U-boats, while most of the merchant ships in convoy arrived safely at their destination. Survival and loss. Ducky Doyle was rescued by the Bib about 8 hours after the sinking. He remembered that during the hours on the raft, they had pulled a number of Army personnel out of the water. At one point, as day dawned in the east, a soldier asked, "Who would like a cigarette?" To everyone's astonishment, he pulled a full, dry pack out of his waterproof jacket. Such is the unpredictability of war. One man keeps his smokes dry while others die. After rescuing the Mallory personnel, the bib returned to escort duty for a week before putting in at Reykjavik on Sunday, 14 February at 1900 to discharge the survivors. 11 of the 34 members of the Naval Armed Guard were lost, including John Dixon, whom Ducky had known little more than a year from the day they enlisted in Philadelphia. Robert Donahue was also killed. Ducky Doyle was 23 when he climbed aboard the bib to live the rest of his life. Dixon was 22 when his life ended.
I don't think my grandmother ever got over it, or my grandfather, that they were immigrants from Ireland, and them losing a son, I really scarred them.
Many of the survivors were hospitalized in Iceland. The Mallory's crew and the 23 Armed Guard survivors were transported back to Boston aboard the USS Chateau Thierry, an Army troop transport that would later become a hospital ship. There is no doubt that this was a melancholy journey. The Mallory survivors had lost many of their shipmates. They had to be thinking about surviving when others did not survive, asking, why me? Why was I saved while John and Robert and others were lost? Such questions may have occupied their minds for months and years to come. Epilogue. Upon arriving in Boston, the men were issued brand new uniforms and gear. Life went on for these veteran members of the Armed Guard. After a survivor's leave, they were each assigned to new stations. After 2 such harrowing convoy runs, Ducky Doyle found lighter duty. It was as if the Navy, understanding that he had already experienced 2 brushes with death in service to his country, kept him safe for a while. In May 1943, Ducky Doyle was sent to Washington, D.C. for duty on board the USS Dauntless, a 258-foot steam yacht moored at the Washington Navy Yard on the Potomac River. It served as the flagship of Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations. During a year of service as a gunner's mate on the USS Dauntless, Ducky saw some of World War II's most important military figures visiting Admiral King's ship. Deck logs during this period indicate that both of President Franklin Roosevelt's yachts, the USS Potomac and the USS Sequoia, tied up from time to time alongside the Dauntless. Following his respite in Washington, Ducky served aboard the USS Abnaki, a fleet ocean tug operating along the East Coast. And just before the Abnaki was ordered to Algeria, he reported for duty on the new minesweeper YMS 462. Beginning in April 1945, the Navy sent him to a series of gunnery training schools in Washington, D.C. and Virginia. And in July, he was transferred to the Anti-Aircraft Training Center at Pacific Beach, California. It appeared that he was readying for assignment to the Pacific Theater when the war ended in August 1945. On 20 October, Edward Thomas Doyle was honorably discharged at the Navy Personnel Separation Center in Bainbridge, Maryland. He had served for 3 years, 9 months, and 6 days. Reflection.
My father, like many veterans, rarely talked about his service in World War II. As children, we were not astute enough to ask questions or understand the need to record that history. There are some anecdotal things my brother and I can add. For myself, Dad told me that the happiest day of his life was when Japan surrendered, because he was poised to transfer to the Pacific, having undergone recent gunner training. He was always proud of his service during World War II. I don't think he ever stopped thinking about the friends that he lost, especially John Dixon, whom he served with from enlistment day through those unforgettable 320 days between April 1942 and February 1943. Dad said his prayers every night. As children, we said our prayers because we had to, and we always wondered why Dad never seemed to miss saying his prayers. I have a strange feeling it had something to do with those 320 days, and probably a lot to do with the 7th of February 1943. My father survived the sinking of the Henry Mallory, but John Dixon and Robert Donahue did not. As a kid, you'd see your father, saying his prayers every night, and I now, as an adult, look at that and say, you know what? I think every night my father was praying because he made it, but he was also praying for his shipmates that didn't make it.
There is probably nothing that can be said or done to make up for the loss of so many young Americans. There are memorials to the Naval Armed Guard across the United States, reminders of what so many young Americans went through aboard the commandeered merchant vessels, the hastily built Liberty ships under extreme weather in mountainous seas kicked up by hurricane-force winds, the U-boat threat, the long hours at battle stations, the lack of sleep, being at sea for months at a time, the everyday reckoning with the harsh reality that this may be your last on board or your last day altogether.
For the Naval Armed Guards, it was duty, it was their job. They were an organized, disciplined military unit.
The American Cemetery and Memorial in Cambridge, England, houses the tablets of the missing. Along the south side of the cemetery, this magnificent wall, some 472 feet in length, pays tribute to all those who were lost in the waters of the Atlantic. Recorded on the tablets are the names and particulars of 5,126 missing in action, lost or buried at sea, or those unknowns. Along the wall are 4 statues of a soldier, a sailor, an airman, and a Coast Guardsman. Inscribed on the wall are the names of the original Gun Crew 256 and other Mallory gunners lost on 7 February. Lewis J. Howard, Jr., Seaman, First Class, USNR, Maryland. Robert J. Bigwood, Seaman First Class, USNR, Massachusetts. Dominic Campagnone, Seaman First Class, USNR, Rhode Island. John J. Dixon, Seaman First Class, USNR, Pennsylvania. Robert A. Donahue, Seaman First Class, USNR, Pennsylvania. Edward C. Duell, Seaman First Class, USNR, Ohio. William R. Laird, Signalman, Third Class, U.S. Navy, Oklahoma. James Joseph Jenkins, Seaman First Class, USNR, New Jersey. Alfred Wolfe, Seaman First Class, USNR, New York. Joseph L. Rohrer, Lieutenant J.G., USNR, Wisconsin. James B. Connolly, Seaman Second Class, USNR, Massachusetts. For their efforts in Convoy PQ-17, Gun Crew 256 received a unit citation. The citation was issued on 15 February 1943, a week after the demise of the USAT Henry R. Mallory and the loss of gun crew members. It is very probably a fact that none of the members of the Gun Crew 256 ever know of the recognition they received. The citation reads, "The Chief of Naval Personnel commends your meritorious conduct as a member of the Armed Guard crew of the SS Samuel Chase during a voyage April 24 to July 12, 1942. A report of the occurrences indicates that on the convoy mentioned above, the enemy planes and submarines launched successive attacks on the convoy, of which the Samuel Chase was a member. When a flight of 25 planes appeared, the Armed Guard crew of the convoy met the attacking planes with a withering barrage, which brought 3 planes to their destruction in the sea. During a later attack by enemy bombers, a hail of fire from the convoy's guns sent 2 planes into flaming crashes, and another was seen to disappear over the horizon, leaving a trail of smoke behind it. Throughout these harrowing days, the men of the Armed Guard crew conducted themselves in a highly efficient and courageous manner. Your outstanding ability and courage contributed greatly to the successful completion of the voyage, and your actions were in keeping with the best traditions of the naval service." Lieutenant J.G. Sexton, the commanding officer of Gun Crew 256 on the Murmansk run, wrote, "One of my greatest regrets is the fact that I did not have a camera and film with me, but we shipped out so quickly that I didn't have time to buy one." It would have been pleasant now to look back on those pictures. We were all new at the game of war, but the naval gun crew, known as Gun Crew 256, was a fine example of young men serving at the time. The original members of Gun Crew 256: John Edward Sexton, Robert Alexander Donahue, John James Dixon, Alfred Wolfe, Edward Thomas Doyle, Tommy Charles Akins, Hasco Buddy Enfield, James Joseph Jenkins, Luke Ernest LaFare, Robert Harold Wolfe, Gilbert William Harris, Jess Lawrence Jensen.